Welcome to what will likely be our final step in our journey through Proverbs chapter 2 before we make our way into chapter 3. We've spent a lot of time here. I have found it to be extremely fruitful. I hope you have too. If this is the first video you're seeing, be sure to go back and check out the rest of our Proverbs series because every video has built on the ones before, and this will likely be no different. We're going to be continuing on from our comparison that we made between the evil man, the path of the evil man and of the forbidden woman, and analyzing these last few verses in the chapter 19 through 22. Now, you need to note that 19 is actually more associated with a passage of the forbidden woman that we've already analyzed, but we never quite got into it, so I just want to spend a minute or two making sure we've asked it the right questions and we've gotten what we need from it before we kind of deal with this conclusionary remarks. So let's go ahead and get into that. I'm going to start by reading at 16, just because we want to get ourselves back into the context we're working with and into this transition from talking about the path of the forbidden woman into these final remarks. So join me at verse 16. So you will be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house sinks down to death, and her paths to the departed. None who go to her come back, nor do they regain the paths of life. So you will walk in the way of the good, and keep to the paths of the righteous. For the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it. Tough words, but a powerful message. So let's take a look at verse 19. None who go to her, her being the forbidden woman, come back. Wow. None who go to her, nor do they regain the paths of life. All right. At first glance, my question would be, is this as permanent as it seems? Is it really the case, if someone has taken the path of the forbidden woman, that they are never going to regain the paths of life? That no one ever comes back? It seems so very unlikely. And perhaps there's two ways we can go about thinking about this. The first is that it's not necessarily hyperbole, but it's demonstrating the seriousness of this path. People have a tendency to want to frolic on these sorts of paths and say, well, I'll enjoy myself now on this path, and then later I'll get on the straight and narrow and I'll, work my life out and it'll all be okay in the end. But this warning of the wise person is telling us, no. It doesn't work like that. If you get on this path, you're not coming back, right? This isn't just a temporary decision. This is a permanent, life-altering decision. And so making sure that seriousness comes across is vital and likely part of why it's worded this way. Now, as someone who believes in the grace of Jesus Christ and that all of us are sinners and that all of us are being redeemed out of these sorts of paths and are repenting from our forsaking, I think the key here is the actor, right? Nor do they regain the paths of life. I think that could say it is not within their power to regain those paths. Because what does regain imply? It's almost like reconquer, right? Or earn. They're not going to be able to do that. Having chosen this path, given that we've all chosen this path, we can't earn our way back to the paths of life. We can't work our way back there. We find that when we consider the paths of the upright, we kind of gave it an upward trajectory earlier in the series, and the paths of the evil men and the forbidden woman, a downward trajectory. It's not just that there's great height separating, but that there's actually a chasm. There's no way to cross it. It just is. And the paths diverge increasingly away from each other. They're getting farther and farther apart the longer you spend on these paths. But thankfully, Christ spans the entirety of the chasm, and therefore he gives the opportunity to regain the paths of life. But they will not regain it. And that's why these decisions are so serious. Because, once again, a theme we've returned to many times in these Proverbs videos is that you have to rely on God. Your power and wisdom and knowledge is not sufficient, but you actually have to have a posture of heart which is humble and receptive. So that's where we are there. So why don't we go ahead and continue into verses 20 through 22. We have a very clear transition. So we're not talking about the forbidden woman anymore. We've switched to you, so you. And remember, we've spent a lot of time talking in verses 12 through 19 about this alternative path, this double-sided coin that is just a bad penny all around. And knowing this, right? This is the final piece of the chapter. Having gone through that initial process and that we spent a lot of time on in verses 1 through 5, and understanding the alternatives, so you, therefore you, would be another way to put that. Therefore you, so you will. Again, you remember we've talked about this will before. It's not might or ought or maybe. This is how it's going to be. So you will walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of righteousness. With an implicit why? For the upright. Who? The upright. This will again, right? This is the completion of a condition. It's not a new condition. It's not maybe, it's they will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it. But the wicked, and wow, he still is hammering in this contrast. But, right, we have another transition. But the wicked, as opposed to the upright, will be. Now that's interesting. It's the same determinative statement. They will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it. Okay. So these are very much parallel. And we'll definitely want to explore that here in a minute. But let's take a closer look at verse 20 and be sure we're asking it some good questions. So you will walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous. Therefore you will walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous. I guess we might just want to be clear on, why? Why is this so determinative? Why will you walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous? Perhaps because you understand. the options. And in understanding these options, it essentially comes down to I receive God's power. I rely on God's power. I choose his path or I choose my own. And to choose God's power is to give up my own power, and yet to be more empowered than I would have been otherwise to more sufficiently and completely walk down the path of God, versus walking in the ways of the evil man and the forbidden woman. And when we truly understand those options, there's only one option to take. And the option of God is an option which comes with surety. We talked about how God is the one who makes possible and the path, who maintains the path, who makes effective the path, who creates change in us through the path. And so it's all reliant on him. And we are in that humble posture of receptiveness and active engagement with him. And so once we reach this point in seeing our options, those who have not chosen the ways of the wicked, and I'm scrolling because I'm looking for these verses, the 9 through 15. Those who understand righteousness and justice and equity and every good path. And why do they understand it? Because the Lord gave them wisdom, and from his mouth came knowledge and understanding. Okay, sorry for all the scrolling. But this is the so. This is the therefore that you will walk. You have gotten knowledge and understanding, and it came from God. And it came from God because you humbly received it. Because, right, you had followed the process in order to be in a posture to humbly receive, to humbly and genuinely receive. And so, why will you walk in the way of the good and keep the paths of the righteous? It's not, let's not be mistaken. It's not out of fear. Though it would be proper to fear that path, although it wouldn't actually be proper. You don't need to be afraid of a path you're not going to take. You can feel sorry for those who are on it. You can pray for and love those who are on it. But you need not be afraid of it, because why not? Why would you not fear it? Because you fear God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Right? You fear God, which means you don't need to fear anything else. Because if you properly fear God, there's nothing else which ought to inspire fear in you. So why will you walk in the way of the good and keep to the paths of the righteous? Because you have received this powerful transformative understanding, an understanding which is a form of reliance upon God to take you through that path because you have properly feared him. All right. Beautiful stuff. Verse 21 and 22. For the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous will be rooted out of it. So there's a very clear contrast here, isn't there? There's the upright, those with integrity. So we have the upright, those with integrity, versus the wicked and treacherous. And those who are upright will inhabit, and they will remain. And those who are wicked will be cut off and rooted out. right? And these are strong contrasts, right? The opposite of inhabiting is to be cut off. The opposite of remaining is to be pushed out. The opposite of upright and with integrity is to be wicked and to be treacherous, right? These are exact opposite. Here again is, well, a sort of coin, right? It's two ways that you can choose. And this is fitting, right? Because this is the end of the chapter. Why are we, one way we could ask this is, why are we talking about this? Why are we phrasing it like this at the end of this passage, right? What is so powerful to use to use them as conclusionary remarks to what has been a very powerful passage? Well, it's because this is the end, isn't it? This is the end, the summary, the sum, perhaps. The reward, the end of the upright is to inhabit the land and to remain in it. The upright will find themselves with life and security. The wicked will find themselves with the opposite, with death and wandering. And this is an ultimate end. It makes me consider the words of Christ, where he talks about who will inherit the earth, right? For some reason, that idea just came with the inhabiting, but it's the meek. The meekness and the upright, they go together with an inheritance in the land. He chose the Jews, a weak and small people compared to many great empires, in order to inhabit his promised land. And they will then remain in it. This is an eternal security in this life. In this life, we have the opposite, don't we? We are sojourners in a land that is not our own. And we don't remain here. And we are consistently rooted out when you look at history, right? Christians are desired to be taken out of the places where they are. And so often is the case, those who are wicked and treacherous will be allowed to inhabit So in this life, in this world, the wicked will inhabit and remain. But the upright will be rooted out and be made to be sojourners. But eternally, it's switched. It's the opposite. Right? Because, as we talked about in the last set of videos, the paths of the wicked are always twisted imitations. They're always deceptions preying upon capacities we have for something good. Our deepest desires, in particular, are for things like life and security, and to remain somewhere that we can call home. And so the paths of the wicked offer us that, except they offer it to us now and not later. And because their paths are dark, we can't see that it won't be there later. We only see what we can have now. Whereas the paths of the upright are long and and light, but you can see to such a distance that you may not see, because it's so far, you may not see the security that awaits you, and therefore be tempted by the security, quote unquote, which can be offered now. This section, these conclusionary remarks are all about perspective, but they're also about where the kind of life you choose to lead ends. If you choose a life of deception, of self-deception, then the result will be being deceived out of those things which you desire most. And if you choose a life of being upright and having integrity, you may suffer through those things which you don't desire to suffer through, but for the sake of your ultimate desire. And therefore your life will form you in such a way as to better appreciate that which you will receive by the end, in the end. But also, in a sense, through the hope that engenders in you, or that places in your heart. It's astonishing to me how much of a trick the paths of the wicked are, and how easy it is to be deceived by them. But praise God that the upright will inhabit the land, and those with integrity will remain in it, ultimately, the very opposite of what we so often experience now. And that this, verse 21 in particular, is hope. And that hope perspective places in our hearts a reality of actually experiencing that thing. That even while we are sojourners, while we are rooted out, while we are not allowed to inhabit and to remain, we experience home and life through the hope of what is to come, instead of settling for a deception that satisfies, or gratifies, I should say, us now, but will ultimately leave us in darkness and destruction. Because that's all it ever promised. But we allowed ourselves to be deceived, at least those who follow those paths, and those of us who find ourselves tempted by and dabbling in those paths. Don't dabble, right? That's what we were reminded of in verse 19. And in fact, this is a perfect time to go back through our summary, isn't it? You cannot go back. The seriousness cannot be understated. That it is not within our power to regain the paths of life, but only through the power of Christ. And therefore, these paths that are made as options to us, we can't tempt ourselves with them. We can't step our toe in it, because to step your toe in it is to be drawn into the depths. You will be, and you may not even notice that you are. And therefore, with the understanding, you will walk in the ways of the good. Understanding which comes from God, because He formed in you a heart which could humbly receive it through the process which He laid out for you to follow, that we discussed in verses 1 through 5. And then we get a beautiful promise that the upright will inhabit and remain, that they will have life and security, that they, though they have experienced in this life being rooted out and being sojourners, will not ultimately be, but that the wicked and the treacherous will be cut off and rooted out, because they don't belong. They haven't been formed in such a way that they actually belong in the land of the upright and of those with integrity. They couldn't even survive there. They wouldn't even know what to do. They couldn't experience it. They would just make it terrible for themselves and for others. It wouldn't be just. And therefore, because they desired to inhabit and remain in this life, that will be granted to them. And they will experience death and wandering in the life to come, or at least, that in a sort of symbolic sense. And the danger is, of course, how deceptive the path of the wicked is. The difficulty is that the path of the upright is difficult. And yet that is why we must rely on the hope which plants in our hearts the reality, a glimpse of the reality of what is to come, that while we are sojourners, through hope and faith, we may begin to experience home and life. And much of that comes through how we engage Scripture, how we begin to have these conversations with God who, as we have often discussed, speaks to us by the words of his mouth, that gives us understanding and knowledge that is pleasant to our soul, discretion that watches over us, understanding that guards us, delivering us from the ways of evil. We can and will be delivered if we rely on God in the ways that he has outlined for us, for he is the giver of wisdom. He is the one that makes the path possible. He is the one who gives of his overabundance into our lives. And if any of those images I just showed confused you, be sure to go back and watch the videos, because this is the sort of thing we've been exploring in this Proverbs, the sort of ways we've been encountering the goodness of God, the ways in which he warns us, the ways in which he gives understanding. We've been experiencing this in real time. And so what more could you ask for proof of the power of the word than to experience it right now, to see it happening as we dig into it? It's actually coming true. What it says will come true. How incredible is that? Where else does that happen? Praise God. And may each one of us be delivered from those paths. May each one of us find his knowledge, his understanding, the fear of him pleasant to our souls. May he watch over us and deliver us from the ways of evil. Look forward to seeing you in Proverbs chapter 3.